Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of our monthly or mostly monthly Simon Talks. We are joined today by my colleague Sophie Johnston from Cork Simon. As you know, I'm just going to let people filter in, so I'm just going to say a couple of kind of housekeeping stuff. Firstly, as regular attenders will know, the Simon Talks are really about us provides us with an opportunity to share the information that we take on board when we think about developing our policy and advocacy. And a lot of that is then filtered through the frontline experience of the Simon communities across Ireland, which gives us where we end up with the positions. But the idea of the Simon Talks is to take that information and the researchers who do it and the organizations who provide it and put it out to the sort of our supporters and people who just have an interest in general policy, so that it gets kind of unvarnished by sort of that process of analysis that we go through. So this month is slightly different in that Sophie works with the Cork Simon community, and the research that they produce is very much based on is the frontline experience. So it's part of that process, but also sort of very closely aligned to where we end up. And I think what has been striking for me over my years of working in the Simon community is how often the experience of Cork Simon, Galway Simon, Midwest Simon, Northwest Simon, those communities, how they so often can be bellwethers for the crises that are coming down the line. And so it's really important that we're constantly linked in with the frontline experience, because that'll tell us, sort of give us early indications of issues that are going to come up and need to be addressed, and where we need to be putting resources and policy. And I think what the program that Cork Simon have put in place around their research and their work has been particularly important for the Simon communities of Ireland to understand where national policy should be going, but also is a huge contribution, I think, to the broader community of policymakers and advocates for the change that's needed to address homelessness. So with that in mind, Cork Simon are today going to talk to us about the insights into single adult homelessness and housing need in the Southwest. And the research today is presented by my colleague Sophie Johnston, who is Research and Communications Coordinator with Cork Simon Community. Sophie's worked for Cork Simon for 12 years, and she holds a bachelor's degree in social science and a master's in cultural policy, both from, one from the degree from UCC and the master's from UCD. So with that, and with your thanks for attending, I will pass over to Sophie. The last two pieces of housekeeping is there is a Q&A box on the bar below Sophie. There's a Q&A and a chat box to the as well. And if you have any questions as Sophie's speaking, do pop them in. We'll deal with the questions after Sophie has finished her presentation. But you don't have to wait. I'll put the questions to Sophie at the end. So as things occur, and feel free to put in more than one question if you have it. And if you are on social media and are tweeting, etc., please do. You can follow us at Simon Community on Twitter, and also the hashtag Simon Talks. If you would use the hashtag, that would allow us to see what you're saying and also support and retweet what you're putting out there. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sophie. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Wayne. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Wayne, for the opportunity to present. So I'll bring up my presentation there. Is that appearing now?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. So insights into single adult homelessness and housing need in the Southwest. So the presentation is based on a paper that we published in June of this year called Single Homelessness in the Southwest, and it's part of our Home Truths series. It's the first paper in this Home Truths series, which is aimed at providing insights and information into the housing and homelessness crisis. And that paper is available on our website, and also lots of material on it on our social media channels. So it's focused on the Southwest, but in the presentation today, I will broaden it out to the national picture in parts. And what I'm going to run through in the presentation today: presentations to emergency accommodation, exits from emergency accommodation, long-term homelessness, and then on the housing side, social housing need and housing stock. So first of all, in terms of presentations, what we're looking at here is Department of Housing data on emergency accommodation presentations from May 2023. And looking specifically at the Southwest, Cork and Kerry, what we see is that the Southwest has one of the highest rates of single adult homelessness in the country, where 3/4 of adults present as single adults, and that's from May. These are the figures across the country. Just bring them in here, and as you can see, the Southeast comes in with the highest figure there at 84%. Followed in May by the Northwest with 80, and then by the Southwest with 76. And the figures obviously vary a bit from month to month. The figures for the Southwest consistently, across the years that the Department of Housing produced their figures, the figures for the Southwest have kind of averaged around the high 70s, 80s. But what we do see as well is that the rates of single homelessness are consistently higher in the Southwest compared to the national average and compared to Dublin. And I just say compared to Dublin because obviously with 2/3 of the homeless population in Dublin, that will influence the national figure. So I think the key here is that it's consistently a higher rate of single adult homelessness. So as I was mentioning, 3/4 in May, 3/4 of adults in emergency accommodation presenting as single adults. And over the last 8 years, the average has been 79, 80. Back in 2015, it was 95% single adults. It dipped, the lowest point was around 2015, where it dipped to 66, or 2/3, when family homelessness peaked, and since then it's been around the 79, 80. So on the second graph here, you can see single adults, the top yellow line, and adults and families, the bottom blue-green line. And you can see where adults and families increased, and then there was a significant decrease. But with single adults, it's been a consistent rise. And just the figure for May 2023, 426 is the number of single adults in the Southwest, and that number has doubled actually in the 8 years since 2015. So I'll just come back here for a moment. With the second graph here, we see this is focused simply on adults, single adults, and adults and families. And if we broaden that out to include children, we would have on the one side single adults, or we could say single homelessness, and then also adults and children, we could say family homelessness. And what we see when we kind of divide it this way, 57% of single adults represent 57% in the Southwest, with adults and children representing the balance. And what we see if we broaden that out nationally, that we see higher rates of single homelessness in the Southwest versus higher rates of family homelessness in Dublin. And just this graph here shows, that the placement, the Southwest would have the second highest rate of single homelessness. And then we see at the other end of the scale, Dublin, where family homelessness would be dominant, and obviously that then affecting the national average, where family homelessness is more dominant. So that brings us on to, sorry, back up with my notes. That brings us on to exits from emergency accommodation. And for exits from emergency accommodation, I looked at homelessness performance reports, taking 2022 as a snapshot. I took 2022 reports because prior to this, these reports presented most of the data for all adults, but since 2022, these reports divided the data among single adults, families, and adults and families. So, we were able to focus in on single adults. And what we see across 2022 is the black bars here, that presentations increased across the year. And down below here, the orange and the yellow. The orange indicates what they call in the report departures, and the yellow indicates exits to tenancies. So the departures are what they term people exiting to stay with friends or family, exiting to medical facilities, hospital or residential, and departures to correctional facilities, and another category of other. So these departures are only presented for all adults. They're not presented for single adults. So on this slide here, I'm just looking at all adults. And when we look at departures plus, well, if we just look at departures first, the orange, we see that departures increased as the quarters increased, and the yellow exits to tenancies fluctuated across the quarters. And if you take an average across those 4 quarters, we see that a quarter of all adults in emergency accommodation in the Southwest left emergency accommodation, but just 9.4% of all adults left to a tenancy. The rest, as I mentioned, left to these other places, friends, family, medical facilities, correctional facilities, and a large category of other within that. So then if we look just at single adults, so can't include what are called departures because that data isn't given in the performance reports. It's just given for all adults, not for single adults. But what is given is presentations. And again, we see the blue line here, that presentations increased as each quarter progressed in 2022, and exits to tenancies fluctuated. And again, if we take an average across the 4 quarters, the average exit to tenancy rate for single adults leaving emergency accommodation in the Southwest was 5.5%. So very, very low. And what this equates to for single adults leaving emergency accommodation in the Southwest, what it equates to is that for every 18 adults in emergency accommodation in 2022, 1 single adult left to a tenancy. And for each single adult that left to a tenancy, there were 2 more new presentations of single adults, 2 more single adults coming in the door. So it's like 1 step forwards, 2 steps back. And just to broaden this out then to the national picture, as I mentioned, an average of almost 9.5% of all adults, single adults and adults and families, exited emergency accommodation in the Southwest to tenancies each quarter in 2022, and 5.5% of single adults exited to a tenancy. And when we look at the national picture, low as these figures in the Southwest are, the national average is actually lower, 6.5% of all adults leaving to a tenancy, and only 4.5% of single adults leaving to a tenancy. And if we look at the graph below, we see there the Southwest highlighted in yellow-orange at 5.5%, the national average at 4.5%. And what we see is that, yes, the rate in the Southwest is very bad. The national average is even worse, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more regions around the country where the rate of exit is worse again than the Southwest. So in producing the report, the Home Truths report that we published in June, I spoke with a number of people staying in our emergency shelter a number of single adults who were searching for accommodation. And I'm just going to pause here and play one of their, a clip from one of their interviews. I'll just get this going now.
There's so many viewings now in Secret. I went to viewings all over. I even went so far as going up to Macroom. I've often went to a viewing and I had to stand in line to get into the building. And landlord bring you up, the people around, and tell you to go. You're the contact. You won't even contact us any place not. My own place would be my own independence. You know, being comfortable with the ones. Here, I know the food is over here and the staff are all people. I don't have my own independence. You know what I mean? Everybody needs food. I mean, it's independence.
Apologies there, that clip didn't match that the subtitles, but here, so what you heard there was Liam, another clip, and this is Tig's account here. If you go in there now and open Daft, very, very rarely, you might get a day there where there's 2 or 3 houses updated, but they're pulled off just as fast as they're put up. But you have to be checking 4 and 5 times a day for when the new properties come up. You could often click into some of the properties and say property viewed by over 30,000 people. I'd still send an email because most of them will say email only. Send in an email and you get nothing back. Over the last 2 years, I've had 1 response and 1 viewing. There was also another like 50 other people at that viewing. I was waiting about an hour when I got there to go in and view the property. Now it was tiny, but I would have taken it. Filled out the application forms, never got an email back. And both Liam and Tig's accounts would be very typical of what we hear in our emergency shelter among people, you know, desperately searching for accommodation and facing all these challenges, facing the challenge of low supply of housing, long waiting lists, long queues, and it's really affecting people's morale. Moving on here to exits to tenants, exit to tenancy routes. So we've covered presentations in emergency accommodation, and looking here at exit to tenancy routes. So we looked at presentations, looked at exits, so the very low rate of 5.5% in the southwest, and for that very small fortunate number who do manage to exit, what we see from the performance, from the Department of Housing's performance reports for 2022 is that 57% managed to secure social housing, 41% found accommodation within the private rented sector, and 3% gained supported long-term accommodation. So just looking at the breakdown within those, and when I say these percentages, these are the percentages of that tiny 5.5%. So the numbers, for example, for the 38% in private rented, that equates to about 50 people. So just looking at the breakdown, the social housing breakdown, 16% secured local authority housing, and the greater majority among social housing, 41% gained housing through approved housing bodies. And within private rented, among the breakdown of that 41 is that 38% secured private rented housing through HAP or Ross, and just 3% by some other means through private rented. And I suppose what it shows, 97, if you take out the 3% who gained private rented through some other means, 97% exited with some form of social housing support. And what we see here is approved housing bodies and the private rented sector are by far the most likely routes for people in the southwest. They're most reliant on these two avenues, as it were, to exit emergency accommodation. And just a comparison here between single adults and adults and families in the southwest. The the first thing of note here is that single adults, as I mentioned, 57% exited through social housing, which would be the black and the grey, whereas adults and families, 78%, over 3/4, left through social housing, the black and the grey. So a greater number of adults and families left through social housing, and almost double the number of single adults as adults and families were reliant on the private rented sector to exit. And then just another comparison between single adults in the southwest and single adults nationally. So the figures here are very comparable, but what we see again for single adults is quite a sizable reliance on private rented. So the same situation for single adults in the southwest and nationally, over a third were reliant on the private rented sector to exit. And that, as we all would be aware, is pretty problematic. The first reason, lack of supply, which I think we all know all about, and as the most recent locked out report showed, only 50 properties available to rent within standard or discretionary HAP rates throughout the country in the most recent locked out report, and only one in Cork. Like daft reports would consistently reiterate this availability there still at a record low. Insecurity of tenure, even if somebody is lucky enough to secure a private rented property through HAP or through Ross, insecurity of tenure is a very real issue. Looking at the RTB, the Residential Tenancies Board's figures on this, over 9,000 notices of termination nationally in the last 6 months of 2022. That would equate to 50 notices to quit every day across the country. And just narrowing that then to Cork, there were nearly 1,000 notices of termination in the last 6 months of 2022. And risk of poverty, even if somebody does manage to secure private rental property, they manage to stay in that property. The CSO's latest Silk report survey they show that of all tenure types, people in private rented accommodation with housing support are at the greatest risk of poverty once their rent is paid. The report found that 1/5 of people are at risk of poverty when housing costs are factored in. But when it comes to households in receipt of rent subsidies, such as HAP or Ross, over 2/3 are at risk of poverty when housing costs are factored in. So for them, homelessness, the return to homelessness really does remain a real risk. So this slide shows long-term homelessness, and I suppose problematic as the private rented sector is, a worse situation is long-term homelessness. And with such low rates of exit from emergency accommodation, rates of long-term homelessness are going to be high. And looking here at the first graph, the top graph, we see that rates of long-term homelessness for single adults in the southwest increased as 2022 progressed. And by the end of the year, 50%, or every second single adult in emergency accommodation in the southwest, was long-term homeless being in emergency accommodation for 6 months or more. And the second graph here just gives a breakdown of the length of time of those people who were long-term homeless, and equates, one part of it here equates to 1 in 8 single adults being homeless for 2 or more years. And just broadening this out to the national picture, we see here, so the southwest, at the end of 2022, 50% of single adults in emergency accommodation in the southwest were long-term homeless. Bad as this is, it's lower than the national average of 53. But we see again from this bar chart here that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if I'm counting right, 6 regions in the country. 6 regions in the country have even higher rates of long-term homelessness than the Southwest. This, unless my clips are jumbled, this is Liam's audio, so I will just skip on from that and move on to this category on social housing need. So this information comes from the summary of social housing assessments, and what we see here is that social housing applicants are divided into 13 categories labelled on this chart A to M, and we can see that the largest category by far, both in the Southwest and nationally, the Southwest being the yellow bar, the national figure being the black bar, the largest category by far is the top one there, single adult, followed by 1 adult and 1 to 2 children. So what we can see there is that 56% of social housing applicants in the Southwest and nationally are single adults. So the largest category by far. This equates to 4,773 people in the Southwest, single adults in the Southwest, on the social housing waiting list, and 32,383 people nationally. And if we look at this chart, what this is showing is the percentage change between social housing assessments from 2021 to 2022. So the number of applicants on the social housing waiting lists actually reduced between the years, and this has been the pattern since 2016. In the Southwest, the overall numbers fell by 2.5%, and nationally they fell by just over 4%. But what we actually see is that the percentage share of single adults increased more than any other household category. So we can see there that nationally, the black line, nationally, the percentage share of single adults increased by 1.5%. And in the Southwest, I've lost my figure. In the Southwest, it increased by 1.5%, and nationally, the percentage share increased by just over 1%. So we see that single adults are the fastest growing social housing category, both in the Southwest and nationally, and it looks like that trend is only going to continue. So I suppose what this is telling us is that single adults are the largest category, they're growing, and it really highlights the need for single unit social housing. So what we've seen so far is the demand. The high numbers of single adults in emergency accommodation, particularly in the Southwest, and high numbers of single adults on social housing waiting lists. So we see the demand, in particular for the demand for single unit accommodation. And on the next 2 slides, just going to look at supply, focusing in on Cork as an example. So this information here comes from the Cork Joint Housing Strategy 2022, and it's based on RTB data from the Residential Tenancies Board. And what we see is that 1 beds have the lowest percentage share across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, across 4 out of 5 of these regions in Cork. And what it equates to is that 1 bed homes account for less than 20% of private rental stock in Cork. And that's actually being generous, saying that it's less than 20%, because it's less than 20% in Cork City, the fifth column down in that bar, in that table, and outside of the city, it's just over 10%. This chart here shows local authority housing stock, and this comes from a NOAC report, the National Oversight and Audit Commission. It's a report on local authority housing stock it's from 2017. It shows that one bedroom housing accounts for less than 10% of social housing stock in Cork City and Cork County Council. Might be a little hard to read there, but on the right, I've pulled out the averages, and we can see that the average across the country for one beds is 11%, with 3 beds having the highest share at 55%. I think you can see that there's the orange in the chart there shows 1 beds. The yellow shows 2 beds. The green shows no separate bedroom, i.e. bedsit. So if you take the green and the orange, that would show no separate bedroom or 1 bed. So there's some variation. There's variation across the city. There's a higher rate in Dublin City, Dun, Leary, Rathdown and Mayo, and then as I said, less than 10% in Cork City and Cork County. So as I mentioned, I spoke with a number of people staying in our emergency accommodation about their experiences of searching for housing, and despair really did come across, and a sense of people's lives being on hold. Here are just some quotes from what they had to say. You've no real hope. Single fella is the worst. Sometimes I feel like giving up. The whole lot of my life is on hold. I know there's a high housing crisis. At the end of the day, it's getting worse. You can't get out of it, and it's not for want of trying. Depressed out of my head. So, people, what we see is people really trying their best against the odds and getting up every day and doing the same thing, searching again, searching and searching and searching, and how they keep their spirits up, I don't know. So, at best, we're seeing great resilience, and at worst, we're seeing despair. So that brings me to the conclusion. So presentations to emergency accommodation. Over 3/4 of adults in emergency accommodation in the Southwest are single adults, one of the highest rates nationally. And I think of particular notice that this is a consistent upward trajectory, doubling in numbers since 2015. Moving over to the right there, exits to tenancies, very low rates of exit. Only 5.5% left to a tenancy. And low as this is, slightly higher than the national average. For every 18 single adults presenting an emergency accommodation in the Southwest, 1 single adult leaves to a tenancy. And as we ran through, approved housing bodies and the private rented sector are the most likely routes out of homelessness, but with the private rented sector carrying a high risk of poverty. With such low rates of exit from emergency accommodation, we're seeing high rates of long-term homelessness. By the end of 2022, every second single adult in emergency accommodation in the Southwest was long-term homeless. Broadening this out to social housing need, we see the high number of single adults in need of accommodation extending here, when we see that over 50% of single adults, over 50% of people on social housing waiting lists are single adults. And looking at the housing stock, it comes nowhere near this. Less than 20% of private rental stock in Cork is 1 bed. Less than 10% of local authority housing in Cork is 1 bed. And as I mentioned, we hear the burden and the strain of homelessness and searching for housing, and how lives are on hold while people go through this almost impossible, against the odds search for housing. And there's much debate about the number of housing units needed, but I think it's clear from this that type as well as number must be considered. And it is clear that we urgently need more single unit social and affordable housing. I'll come back to you there, Wayne.
Yeah, Sophie, thank you so much. I hit the wrong button there, but I'm back. Firstly, thank you for that. There's a huge amount of data in it, and sort of you've taken a really sort of holistic overview of or rather married holistic overview of housing, homelessness, presentations, and the sort of the flow in sort of around and through the community there, as well as comparing it to the national, and also inserted, really importantly, the voice of people actually experiencing homelessness, which is critical to this kind of research, that we don't lose sight of that people don't become numbers. So what I'd say, if anybody does have any questions on that, there was a lot of data, so it'll probably take a little bit of time to process. So I'll keep talking for a little bit while you think about your questions, and I'll put some more questions to you, Sophie. So I suppose really at the end, the conclusion where we get to is the importance of secure, affordable accommodation. And while we talk a lot about supply will obviously be critical, but it is actually affordability and security which are absolutely a part of it. I just wonder, in the reflections, and you talk about the private rented market being unsustainable. Were there many examples, or any examples from in your experience of people who are exiting into private rented, but then the landlord selling up and them having to come back in again, or those kind of, I suppose, the cyclical nature of some of that pressure?
I did speak to somebody who was using our soup run, who relied on the soup run from time to time because of stretched finances. So in that difficult position of affordability, so still, he had gained housing, but was still relying on homeless services to bridge the gap sometimes in order to pay his rent. So highlighting, I suppose, the inaffordability. But what definitely came across, from speaking with people in the emergency shelter who are searching, how impossible really it seems, how, as we're saying, how they get up every day and do the same again and again and search again and again, because it's their only option. But the outcome, the chances, and I suppose the research now shows that, 5.5% managing to secure a tenancy, and an even lower percentage managing to secure a tenancy in private rented accommodation. The chances are so slim, and without knowing that particular figure, they know that the chances, that it's nearly hopeless, but they have no other choice. So, getting up every day, doing the same again. One person spoke about how he was in employment, and speaking about how you need to be checking 4 to 5 times a day for when new properties are put up on Daft. And he spoke about how hopeless it is, but how he keeps doing the same thing because he has no other choice. He must, that he'll send an email. He knows he probably won't get a reply. And this person was incredibly dedicated. It was like he had 2 jobs. His second job was searching for housing. And he said that he had 1 response and 1 viewing in 2 years. And he wasn't successful with that property.
That really sets out to sort of the human experience of I suppose we have our regular lockdown, the market report, which kind of captures some of that, but I suppose that's really the sharp end of it. We have a couple of questions coming in, so I'll put them to you one at a time. And the first one is a practical one. The Department of Housing is currently seeking submissions on the private rental sector. What recommendations do you feel we should be making in terms of assisting single people?
Well, I suppose the HAP rate, while it was increased, I think it was last summer, for it was increased. The discretionary rate was increased to 35%. It still doesn't come near the asking price. So I suppose an increase in the HAP rate for single people, and I know it was increased to the rate of couples, but it still doesn't come anywhere near market rents. So as a starting point, increasing the HAP rate would be I think an obvious first call. It would at least give people reliant on HAP a little more chance. It would bring them up a little more on a par with everybody else who's out there, who they're competing with. So they're not competing on an even ground.
And I suppose one of the things comes across in your sort of conclusions as well is that perhaps we need to look at the entirety of the housing system, the private rental market. And the questioner's question is probably because the government are looking at the private rental sector, but that kind of compartmentalization of it leads us sometimes to look at, okay, well, this section, when rather we need to be looking at the totality of it. And I think the housing stock, the local authority housing stock of single units, and the focus there perhaps on larger units, it needs to be something to be addressed.
Yeah.
The second question was, firstly, outline your excellent insights. Do you have data on single adults who, by way of their salary, could qualify for social housing? This is slightly outside of your own report, I think. Could qualify for social housing, but for whatever reason haven't. This could be a marker beyond the housing list of real need.
I don't have the data relating to that.
No.
That wouldn't have, sorry, that wouldn't have come within this report.
I think, I suppose the other aspect, a number of people have done some work, you looking at actually the housing assistance payment and being cognizant of the fact that so many landlords are leaving the system, that really we should be including those people who are on a housing assistance payment. Perhaps you'd categorize them differently, but they should be part of the consideration for social housing need beyond the social housing assessment sort of that the department and the individual local authorities collated by the housing agency do. So we should be perhaps looking at that broader picture. And then there are people who, I mean, I think again, one of the things with the locked out of the market report is at one time you could call, if you look at the base rates of the housing assistance payment, probably you could look at in the range of affordability. But when you start adding on the discretion, which we do, actually you're looking at close on for a family with 3 children, not to get away from single adults, but you're looking at 2,000 a month. And that isn't necessarily sustainable or affordable for a low income family who wouldn't maybe meet the criteria for social housing. I think that speaks to a lot of that, is that yes, we don't have that sort of insight more broadly, but there are other sources of data which perhaps we could mine for some of that. Do you have any stats data on a person with a conviction successfully seeking and securing appropriate accommodation to homeless services upon release from custody?
I don't know that we have stats on that, but that that would among service users among people that we would work with, like that can be a barrier among many other barriers for them in trying to secure accommodation and trying to secure housing. The list of obstacles and barriers that are in their way. It's not just affordability. It's references. This of course is if you're looking for private rented housing and you're kind of competing in the open market, as it were. Employment references, housing references, and these are all extra barriers that come in the way, and also what comes across speaking with people is perceived prejudice, you know, that they feel the isolation and they feel the stigma of homelessness, and I suppose confidence can be low, and they you know, they can feel a sense of dejection almost before they begin, and understandably when the odds are so stacked against them. So you know, that can feed in also.
Yeah, I think that's we know there are and it's a good question. It highlights the need for when somebody is leaving correction, they've done the, you know, they've met the sort of the consequences of their actions, and rather than, you know, given the state of the housing system, too many people are falling into homelessness after leaving that, rather than being supported to, you know, hopefully start afresh. And we talk about the fact that housing is our social infrastructure, which I think again your report highlights that about, and particularly in the personal experience of service users, that sense of the life being on hold, and, you know, on top of that, a creeping sense of hopelessness at times. But actually the big part of it is you've all this human potential that's being held on hold, instead of making the contribution that's so clearly there. Because one of the things I think from my time working in services is, it sounds like reverse, but the level of resilience and humor and all those things that exists in the services for people who are experiencing homelessness can at times be, you know, it's a credit to our humanity a lot of times. So it's really, you know, that all that potential is locked away because they don't have that safety net, that support of a home to move on from. It's just it's indictment, I think, really, particularly of policy. So we don't have any more questions coming in, but please do. We have a couple of more minutes. So I suppose just to broaden out the discussion, when you're looking at the different factors, I suppose within that, one of the supports that people who are exiting homelessness, and you noted in particular the rise in long-term homelessness over time, but you're obviously in Cork Simon and the Southeast very you're leading along with colleagues in Focus Ireland on Housing First in a number of those areas, and it's been a very successful program down there. So what impact or has that had on the long-term homelessness, and where would we be were it not for, did we have a sense of where we would be if it were not for the success of Housing First?
I think that probably shows in that graph on long-term homelessness, where awful as it is that every second person in emergency accommodation, every second single adult in emergency accommodation in the Southwest by the end of 2022 was long-term homeless, and those numbers increased slightly each quarter. Bad as that is, and it's awful when you look just at the Southwest, but then when you look at the national picture, you realise the Southwest is actually in a better position than about 2/3 of the regions in the country, and that, it's really hard. It's really hard to believe that you could get worse than that 50% mark. So long-term homelessness was, we know from our figures, long-term homelessness increased in our emergency shelter in 2022, but in the years prior, in the 2 to 3 years prior, it was reducing, and pressure on services has increased significantly since the lifting of restrictions, since the lifting of COVID restrictions. So I think that's accounted for the increase that we saw in 2022 in long-term homeless figures. But I think you can see Housing First working with those decreases that we saw over the previous number of years. in 2020, 2021 in long-term homelessness. And when you compare it to the national picture, you do see that it is, I suppose, that is showing the effectiveness of Housing First, the philosophy behind it being housing those who are homeless the longest with the most complex needs, and therefore, reducing long-term homelessness.
And I think it just, I suppose we're really building on the theme here, but Chrissy has put in a question: if nothing changes on the housing front for single adults, what will the impact be on existing services?
Well, we're already at full capacity, and I suppose to put it bluntly, we can see the demand for housing, we can see the supply of housing, and we can see already the enormous mismatch, and we're already at full capacity. So we all know how critical increasing supply of housing is, and I think there also needs to be a focus on the type of housing. There needs to be a high proportion of single unit housing, because if there is two and three bed, as one of the people that I spoke to in the emergency shelter said, they're just not putting single people into two beds, and that is the way, of course. A shortage of housing, you have a two bed, you're going to allocate it to two people, so single people are being left behind. There needs to be single unit accommodation. Like ideally you'd have two beds, you'd have enough 2-bed units for single people as well. So you'd have flexibility there for people in their lives, as lives change and that. But as an absolute basic, we need more single unit housing to address the changes, and not just to address the high proportion of single adults in emergency accommodation, but to address the changing demographics, which we can see across the whole country, as we can see from the social housing waiting lists, and that you can broaden out. Again, you can broaden that out even further into changing demographics nationally, and the decrease in household sizes and the rise in general of single unit households. And you can broaden that out again and look at it on a European scale, and we can see where Ireland is going to head. The trend across Europe is for an increase is ever increasing single unit households. So that's the way that it's going. So it's for the sake of single homeless people, it's for the sake of single people in need of social housing, and it's for the sake of general housing supply and changing demographics across the country.
Yeah, I think that's very much. I mean, one of the things that really stands out of it, we've been talking obviously with the lockdown report coming out yesterday. We've been talking a lot about that, and the fact that the international experience is, if you don't have a secure, affordable housing system, has supply of housing that people can access, then you're going to see increases in homelessness. And I think both your report and your analysis there highlights that really what's at stake here is the levels. If we want to address homelessness by 2030, if we want to see reductions in those very high numbers of people long-term in homelessness and all of the health and consequences, really, we have to get the housing supply and the affordability of housing right. I think that's absolutely spot on. So with that, I think that's a good place to kind of close out our conclusion. I want to thank everybody for coming along. I would say that we won't have a Simon talk in August, and in September we have Simon Week. So on the 25th of September, we will actually have our annual conference, which will be a live event. So hopefully you'll all be getting an email about that, and you'll put it in your diary. Actually, we'll be talking to our keynote speaker is Professor Colbert from Seattle in university. There he's coming to Ireland, and he's going to be speaking to us about a publication he brought out recently. It's very well received, looking at the fact that homelessness is a housing problem, and really interesting data from across all the states in the US, sort of highlighting the critical importance of housing when it comes to homelessness. So on that, we will, with our thanks to everybody for coming along today, and our thanks again to Sophie for all her work, because Sophie's obviously the main researcher who's provided that report, but also for presenting to us today. So thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the week.